As a political stalemate continues, the human rights situation has also not improved. Since my last briefing here, 20 protesters were killed and at least 1,700 injured. I've more than once deemed it necessary to publicly condemn the excessive use of force by security forces, as well as their targeting of health facilities and medical staff. The political crisis in Khartoum also contributes to instability in the rest of the country. Peace talks between the government and the SPLM North that were paused in the summer of 2021 have not resumed. Particularly worrisome is a surge of violence in Darfur and the Blue Nile. From May to August, UNITAMS documented 40 incidents of intercommunal violence resulting in the deaths of more than 300 civilians. National and local authorities, including the commander of the Rapid Support Forces, leaders of the Juba peace signatories, regional and state governors, native administration and civil society leaders have all made attempts at brokering reconciliation agreements in Darfur and the Blue Nile, but the sustainability of these agreements remains uncertain in the absence of effective state authority. I urge all communities to refrain from hate speech, which is increasingly fueling communal tensions. And I urge the authorities to urgently address protection gaps. There should be no doubt that the responsibility for the protection of civilians rests on their shoulders. Madam President, the lack of implementation of the Juba peace agreement continues to contribute to instability. Protocols to address the drivers of the conflict in Darfur, including wealth sharing, justice, land issues, and the return of the IDPs, remain unfulfilled. In the absence of a political agreement, it will be difficult to advance these issues. One positive step, as mentioned by the permanent representative of Sudan in the last session, was a graduation on 3rd of July of the first batch of 2,000 fighters from the Juba peace agreement signatories for the Joint Security Keeping Force in Darfur. The UN has contributed to the training of these forces on human rights and international humanitarian law. But this graduation was only a first step. The force has not actually been fully established with matching numbers of soldiers from the regular forces, and it has yet to be deployed. I urge the authorities to begin with the deployment of these forces and thereby improve the protection of the population. Madam President, humanitarian needs are now at record levels due to the combination of ongoing political instability, economic crisis, a rise in intercommunal violence, poor harvests, and now floods. 11.7 million people are facing acute hunger, and this number is growing. While the UN and partner organizations managed to reach 7.1 million people in need since January, the 2021 humanitarian response plan is only funded at 32%, less than a third. Members of the Security Council, in this challenging context, the United Nations has been working with partners to strengthen community stabilization efforts and resilience building. Integrated approaches supported by the Peace Building Fund have been put in place to address risks induced by climate change and food insecurity in Darfur. UNITAMS and the UN family also continue to offer support to national and state authorities in the implementation of the National Plan for the Protection of Civilians. And UNITAMS continues to advise and train Sudanese police forces in community policing, addressing sexual and gender-based violence, and the protection of civilians. Workshops and trainings over the past few months have involved more than 400 police personnel and 1,100 community members, usually in cooperation with the Sudanese police, other UN agencies, civil society, and the respective state prosecutors' offices. And the Permanent Ceasefire Committee, chaired by UNITAMS, has continued to engage in order to de-escalate tensions, resolve disputes between signatory parties to the Juba Peace Agreement, and undertake capacity-building activities with local authorities. It has conducted investigations following formal requests from the parties, including after the conflict in Karenik and El Janina in April this year. Excellencies, let me sum up. Nearly a year after the military takeover of 25 October, Sudan still lacks a fully functional and legitimate government. The decision of the military to withdraw from politics and the recent initiatives by civilian forces offer a window of opportunity for both the military and political forces to reach an agreement on the way forward. Time is of essence, however. The longer the political paralysis exists, the more difficult it will become to return to the transition which UNITAMS is mandated to assist. I urge all actors to seize the opportunity and reach an agreement on a solution that enjoys legitimacy in the eyes of Sudanese women and men. We, the United Nations, and our partners in the trilateral mechanism remain steadfast in our efforts in that direction. I count on this Council and the broader international community to back our efforts and to offer coordinated support to Sudan at this critical time. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Pretius for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Ibrahim Moudawi.
Oui. Monsieur Moudawi, nous...
Mr. Moudawi, we cannot hear you.
Je crois qu'on a... Qu'est-ce qu'on fait autour? Le micro...
Mr. Moudawi, we do not hear you. Perhaps you might turn on the microphone.
It is enabled, actually.
Cela fonctionne, on a entendu quelque...
It is working. We've heard something now.
Hello?
Oui, ça fonctionne, merci.
Yes, it is working. Thank you.
Hello?
Oui, vous avez la parole, monsieur.
Yes, you have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Madam President, for giving me this opportunity to address the Security Council on Sudan. It is actually a complicated issue where I will be addressing certain points on this. Mr. Pearce have given an overview for what is happening. You know, the overthrow of the regime, the Islamic regime in 2019 had provided an opportunity for us as Sudanese to transit from dictatorship to democracy. But unfortunately, while we are doing the transition, that transition, we had a military coup on the 25th of October. And since then, everything, is not actually, stand still, but it is deteriorating. The situation in the different areas in Sudan, there is a lot of, growing fighting, growing insecurity for the people in Darfur, that especially in areas of Darfur, that the protection of civilians is a big problem for all of us. There is problems with food. There is problems with administration. There is nothing is moving in this time, and we have spent all this time trying to bring civilians together so that we can agree on a civilian transition, because the demand by all the Sudanese people is that we wanted a civilian-led government, and this civilian-led government has to be formed by civilians. It's not the military who formed the civilian government. The military, after the coup, immediately after the coup, they have been trying with different civilians to accept the role of prime minister and to form a government, but all civilians has not accepted because there is no one will go and work under the military rule. The military, in reality, they have now said that they wanted to give up power for civilians. And we have been working with different civilians, with different political parties and civil society to try to bring people to agree on a way forward. This effort have not been one. It has been several efforts by several people trying to bring people together. But at the end of the day, recently we managed as civil society to bring in, under the Sudanese Bar Association initiative, to bring in the FFC, the Freedom and Change parties who have been part of the previous government, and one of the biggest parties which have not been part of the previous government is the Democratic Unionist Party original, and the Ansar al-Sunnah, and the PCP, and the Popular Congress Party. This initiative actually have managed to gather around it many of civil society organizations, many of professional organizations, and many of the youth. And it is the only credible initiative now, which we can, build on it and reach to an agreement on having a civilian government and sending the military to the barracks. Sending the military to the barracks, it is easy said, but it's not really simple. You have the Sudanese army, Sudanese armed forces. You have the RSF. You have the factions who have signed the Juba peace agreement. They are all military components, and they need to be unified in one professional army, and they need to be, taken into barracks so that they are not roaming, among civilians, which is the case now, especially in areas like Darfur and Blue Nile and South Kordofan. And if they remain, roaming around, the words saying that we are going to the barracks or having, the army have moved out of politics, this remains only a dream. The need is that these people have to go back to the barracks. They have to stay in the barracks, and they have to start a process of unifying one arm in a process of classifying these people, classifying the different armies, the different groups who have been formed, and bringing them into barracks, doing the trainings, doing demobilization and all this, so that we can have a unified army. Unless we have a unified army, there will always be a risk that we will be in a risk that, we'll have fighting between these factions, and that might lead to the, civil war. The big problem now is that these different factions, different militaries that are within the towns, and staying within the towns is a risk, actually, causing many problems for the people. In rural areas, especially in Darfur, you have the civilians being under threat all the time. They are not able to go farming because of the threat of being attacked by different groups. You can't tell who is who because everyone is wearing a military uniform and taking up arms. There is in a way or that the state doesn't exist in the state authority doesn't exist, and people are just behaving the way they want it, and all these groups are behaving the way they want it. So unless we have a unified army, having a civilian government will bring a civilian government without authority. We need to have a civilian government who is in power, who is in control, and that means all the armies, not only the Sudanese armed forces, but all the armies has to go back into the barracks. There are needs, actually. There are needs now. There are a state of emergencies everywhere. During the rainy season, many floods have happened, and many houses have been destroyed, many villages have been destroyed, and the response from the government is very weak, if not if it does exist, and the needs are very high, and there is no someone who is assisting. It is only very limited assistance given by the UN and some international organizations, and there is a lot of needs. The problem is that the economic situation of almost all the society is deteriorating, and we are seeing now many strikes coming, professionals who are, asking for increase in wages because of the inflation, because they cannot, survive. The Minister of Finance, he said himself that what we give to the, a civil service, a civil servant doesn't, satisfy his need for 12 days. So that means that there is 18 days the civil servant cannot eat, and he has to find other means, to get food. And this situation cannot continue forever unless we stabilize the situation by getting a civilian-led government, a civilian-led government which is, have a credit with the society. It's not a civilian government, any civilian government which we group civilians and say this is the government. It is a civilian government which is accepted by the population, especially the youth who are going down on the streets every day. And we need such a civilian government with credible persons who are not partisan, so that we can lead the transition. There are main things in the transition has to be done because we are all having different views in this country, and it have been widely accepted that we will go into a societal dialogue where Sudanese people agree on a way how this country can be ruled, how New Sudan can be made, and that societal dialogue, we said that has to be a constitutional dialogue where it will end with a constitutional conference with representatives from all the Sudanese people. The main thing for the transition is to stabilize the economy and to start reforming the civil service and start the process of, this constitutional conference, so that at the end of the transitional period, Sudanese can reach to an acceptable model of governance, and that and that they all agree upon this model, and where elections can happen. Also, there are other issues which have to be solved is the transitional justice, that there is a lot of, atrocities which have been committed during the 30 years and also after the uprising and the downfall of the regime in April 2019. There is lots of killing. People have been killed, over 100 youth have been killed since the October coup, and there were so many people who have been killed on the 3rd of June. Some of them have not yet been identified, and all these issues of atrocities have to be addressed. The way which all of us as Sudanese are agreeing on is a transition justice model, which will address these issues of violations which were committed during the Islamic regime, on the 30 years of the Islamic regime rule, and after the downfall of Bashir. So these are the main issues which we should be, looking for. And I think one of the major things we need now is a civilian government that can address the economic situation. This is an emergency which the civil government has to address. In other services like schools, health, it's just all deteriorated. We have dropout from the schools, which amounts to more than 60% in the basic education, which has to be addressed. We have homeless, so many people who are homeless now. It is estimated like 1 million in Khartoum, those youth who are homeless. And, the hospitals, the clinics, all these have deteriorated also. It is a risk that going now in a hospital, because the hygiene, the environment at which the hospitals are running are very difficult. Also, the environment for the medical doctors and all those people, the pay is very little, so that they actually cannot survive this situation. So the need now is that we need a civilian government, and we need that the army should go to the barracks. The armies has to be offered. All these armies has to be offered an incentive that they have to go to the barracks and that they have to have training how to deal with people. And we need a reform for the civil service. We have a very big size of civil service, which we have inherited from the previous regime, and with, non-professionals and non-qualified persons in the different places. Situation of women and children is there, that women, all women in the rural areas are heading families. They are trying, to work and to gain food for their families. And in areas, in conflict areas like Darfur, where people have been killed during the war, and definitely many of the women are now heading their families. Although we have agreed that we need to have a good representation for women during the transitional period, unfortunately, that didn't happen. we have all agreed that 40% of women of the government positions has to go to women, but that didn't happen. Now, with the initiative of the Sudanese Bar Association, we have agreed that 50% of the cabinet should go to women, 50% of the Sovereign Council has to go to women, more than 40% has to be the representation of women in the Legislative Council. So, to conclude, I think we need to have more pressure on the military, so that they have to give power and they have to go to the barracks. We need to train the military so that we can have a modern, united Sudanese army. The priorities for the coming government has to be addressing the economy, has to stabilize the economy, has to find means how to give food for the people to survive, so that they can start going to farms, farming, or doing this. Addressing issues of security in Darfur. This is crucial, because the problem is what have been suggested as a mechanism by the Juba Peace Agreement as a mechanism for civilian protection is not working. In reality, this is not working, because these forces are composed of tribes, and those tribes, actually, when there is a conflict, each one will side with his tribe, and we have seen this in North Darfur, we have seen it in West Darfur. We need to find another mechanism for protection of civilians. We have to explore other options. How can we protect civilians? How can we train? Can we get, soldiers or police from other areas of Sudan to go into the other regions, not to allow people from the same region to protect civilians? These are issues. Issues of bandits also has to be addressed. Still, there are people who are roaming around. Unfortunately, they're wearing, military uniform, and they're doing a lot of, crimes in the scene in these places. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank Mr. Mudawi for his briefing. And I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, President. I'm grateful to SRSG Pertez for his briefing and for his and his team's tireless efforts. I also thank Dr. Mudawi for his account, which we followed closely. And I welcome the presence of the Permanent Representative of Sudan at our meeting today. I would like to make 3 points in response to what we have just heard. First, the political situation. We regret that limited progress has been made since the SRSG last briefed us in May. We take note of his cautious optimism today following recent moves towards a negotiated outcome. We hope this momentum can bear fruit. The United Kingdom condemns the excessive use of force by security forces, which led to the deaths of 9 protesters on the 30th of June. As we've heard, this takes the total number of protesters killed since the coup to 117. The United Kingdom calls on the Sudanese authorities to stop all violence against protesters and for perpetrators of human rights violations to be held to account. We further urge the military component to engage constructively in the political process and fulfill their stated commitment to withdraw from the political scene. Secondly, Sudan is facing an urgent economic and humanitarian crisis. ordinary citizens continue to suffer. Bureaucratic and security-related impediments are limiting the international community's ability to deliver humanitarian aid to those most in need. We urge the authorities to remove these barriers immediately. Only a civilian-led transitional government can put the country on the road to recovery and allow for the full resumption of international support, including debt relief. Third, President, the United Kingdom is deeply concerned by the increased violence in West Darfur State and the Blue Nile region. The recent graduation of members of the Joint Security Keeping Force is a welcome step. Further steps are urgently needed to implement the security arrangements of the Juba peace agreements, address the root causes of conflict in Darfur, and achieve sustainable peace. To conclude, President, the United Kingdom fully supports the efforts of UNITAMS, along with the AU and IGAD, to help facilitate a Sudanese-led process to resolve the political crisis. We urge all Sudanese actors to come together in good faith and in a spirit of compromise in order to deliver on the population's demands for freedom, peace and justice. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for that statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of Ireland. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Volker, for your briefing. Ireland strongly supports the work of UNITAMS, the AU and IGAD in Sudan, and I want to thank you and your team for your tireless efforts. I also want to thank Mr. Mudawi for his thoughtful intervention. Madam President, the deeply damaging consequences of last year's military coup are now clearly manifesting throughout the country. No aspect of Sudanese society has been left untouched by the fractured politics in Khartoum. We see this in the political and security turmoil, as well as in the deteriorating economic, social, and humanitarian environment. I'm particularly alarmed by the increasing militarization of Sudanese life and rising armed conflict against civilians. Moreover, this crisis is occurring in a context of growing regional instability and a global food crisis, which is particularly impacting the Horn. In Sudan today, hunger is now a looming reality for millions, an upsetting reversal in a country that has traditionally been a global leader in the areas of agricultural production. Food costs are soaring, and access to basic goods is limited due to the effects of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine. This situation is being exacerbated by severe flooding and the impacts of climate change. Once again, it is the most vulnerable that are suffering the most. Ireland and the European Union will continue to provide life-saving humanitarian assistance to those that need it most. Madam President, as we've heard from the SRSG, only genuinely inclusive politics can be the foundation for addressing the acute challenges Sudan is facing. The military's announcement that it would withdraw from the political process to allow space for real dialogue is positive, but only if rhetoric is accompanied by action. We urge the military to facilitate an environment that is conducive to genuine progress. The SRSG told us an opportunity exists to end the crisis. While there may be an opening, all stakeholders need to put aside their differences and grasp this opportunity to shape Sudan's political future in a spirit of compromise and consensus. The window of opportunity to chart a path back to a civilian-led democratic transition may not be open for long. We call for redoubled support from the international community to facilitate consensus building among Sudan's democratic stakeholders and to bolster the role of UNITAMS and the trilateral mechanism. For this process to have any chance of success, women must be fully and meaningfully involved. And there's more work to be done on this, as we've heard from Mr. Mudawi. Madam President, we are deeply concerned by continued reports of excessive use of force against peaceful protesters by the military authorities and associated armed groups across the country. This is unacceptable and must end. All human rights violations and serious crimes against civilians, including sexual violence and violations against children in armed conflict, must be investigated and those responsible held to account in a timely manner. Ultimately, we have to get to a point where the military accepts the democratic aspirations of the Sudanese people. They must resist the temptation to cling to illegitimate power and work in partnership with their Sudanese brothers and sisters to realise a better future. Madam President, while the political process develops in Khartoum, the authorities continue to have a responsibility to protect their own people throughout the entire country. Recently, in West Darfur and Blue Nile, hundreds of civilians were massacred. I want to express our sincere condolences to the families of the victims. The authorities must do everything they can to protect civilians, ensure accountability, and tackle the root causes of this violence. This includes making real progress in the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement and the Sudanese National Protection of Civilians Plan. In conclusion, Madam President, let me reiterate our call for all Sudanese stakeholders to come together to find a way out of this political stalemate. The stakes are too high for the people of Sudan, and the risks are too great for the stability of the region if they don't. Now is the time to restore Sudan's democratic transition for the benefit of all its people. Thank you.
Je remercie.
I thank the representative of Ireland for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
Thank you, President, and our thanks to the briefers for their insight, and a special thanks to the SRSD for your tireless efforts. Almost 11 months after the military takeover, our main message remains the same. Only a civilian-led transitional government and a clear but realistic timetable for election can solve the political crisis and pave the way for full resumption of international partnerships with Sudan. The announcement by the Sovereign Council Chair, General Burhan, that the military forces will withdraw from the political scene once the civilian government is in place is an important signal. And we hold the military and security forces to this commitment. There can be no return to authoritarian rule or a normalization of the current situation. Therefore, we welcome also the publication of the Sudan Bar Association's draft transitional constitutional framework, which is a result of in-depth discussion involving a wide range of actors. Together with other constructive initiatives, these efforts, led by the Sudanese people themselves, are evidence that it is possible to break the current impasse. Now we call on all stakeholders to maintain the momentum that has been created and ensure that women and youth are part of the process. Any agreement or government resulting from a non-inclusive process will lack credibility with the Sudanese people and the international community. The tripartite initiative of the United Nations, the African Union, and IGAD is well placed to facilitate and support Sudanese stakeholders in these efforts. President, we are deeply concerned about reports of increased violence in part of Sudan, including well-documented cases of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as grave violation against children. The government has a fundamental responsibility to actively protect all civilians by taking concrete measures. It is also the government's responsibility to allow and facilitate the full, safe, and unhindered access of humanitarian assistance. Bureaucratic impediments can and should be removed without delay. The Juba Peace Agreement signatories and other armed actors also have the same responsibilities to abide by humanitarian principles. President, We want to highlight also that there are some positive developments, as described in the Secretary General's report. For example, we welcome the graduation of the first batch of the Joint Security Keeping Force. This is an important step towards a genuine united force, as Volker Perthes said himself. The next step is to ensure that the newly graduated forces are deployed and equipped to fulfill their tasks. Other dimensions of security sector reform should also follow, as per the security provisions in the Juba Peace Agreement. Mobilizing resources is first and foremost the responsibility of the authorities, with UNITAMS mandated to provide support, including through the Permanent Ceasefire Committee. President, the economic crisis, marked by high inflation and shortages, is having an alarming impact on food security and livelihoods. People in marginalized and war-affected areas are particularly vulnerable. They have no safety nets. We must scale up humanitarian action to meet emerging needs and prevent an even more dire situation next year. And finally, President, the current conflict dynamic in the Horn of Africa must be of utmost concern to this Council. In particular, the impact of the renewed fighting in Tigray, which has serious and immediate consequences on neighboring countries. We encourage and support the good offices of the African Union and the UN towards reducing tension and promoting dialogue. I thank you.
Je remercie la
I thank the representative of Norway for that statement. And I now give the floor to the representative of the United Arab Emirates.
Madam President, I thank the Special Representative, Mr. Perthes, for his comprehensive briefing on recent developments in Sudan, including the latest work of the trilateral mechanism. We also followed the briefing by Ibrahim Mudawi, and I welcome the participation of Ambassador Al-Harith Mohammed in today's meeting. Madam President, a clear path out of the political impasse has yet to emerge. However, despite mounting challenges facing the country, the UAE believes that tangible progress in the country remains possible through intensive support from the international community. Regarding the updates on the efforts of the trilateral mechanism, including the ongoing engagement with Sudanese stakeholders, we note that the meeting on the 8th of June demonstrated the importance of holding an inclusive dialogue across all segments of Sudanese society to reach a sustainable agreement. We also note the meeting on the 9th of June, which aimed at bridging different views, marked both a vital and necessary step towards prioritizing national interest and promoting reason and wisdom to overcome differences in the interests of the people of Sudan. We also hope that the military component's announcement regarding its withdrawal from the negotiations sponsored by the trilateral mechanism will help the political forces reach an agreement on the formation of a technocratic government. To this end, and as we mentioned before, Sudanese ownership over the political process is vital for the success of the transitional process. As for the difficult economic situation, accompanied by the humanitarian conditions that are exacerbated by the floods and severe food insecurity, it is important for international donors to consider revising their recent decisions. Doing so could prevent Sudan's economy from collapsing and help with its recovery. The international community must also intensify its support for the Sudan to alleviate the suffering of those affected by the climate impacts. In this context, we offer again our sincere condolences and sympathies to Sudan, its people, and the families of the victims of the devastating floods. We also affirm the UAE's continued commitment to provide relief assistance through its air bridge recently launched in support of those affected in Sudan. As for the security situation, we believe that national mechanisms in Sudan are important for de-escalating tensions, including the sponsorship of several local peace agreements in response to clashes between tribes in West and South Darfur. Additionally, while Sudan has received limited support for the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement, significant progress has been made in security arrangements in Darfur, which is reflected, for example, in the efforts of the Permanent Ceasefire Committee and the recent graduation of the first class of Joint Security Keeping Forces. For Sudan to make further progress, the international community must intensify its efforts and provide technical and financial support so the country can ensure stability throughout Darfur. In conclusion, the UAE reaffirms its support for the aspirations of the Sudanese people and reiterates its respect for Sudan's sovereignty, independence, territorial integrity, and national unity. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Madam President. Thank you, SRSG Pertez, for your comprehensive briefing. We commend you and your team for supporting the people of Sudan and their aspirations to restore a civilian-led transition to democracy. The United States continues to fully support the collaborative efforts of the UN Integrated Transition Assistance Mission in Sudan, UNITAMS, the African Union, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development to facilitate a Sudanese-led political process to restore a civilian-led transition to democracy. Following the public commitment of Generals Burhan and Hamedi to accept a civilian agreement on a new government, we welcome inclusive dialogue of civilian pro-democracy parties to develop new constitutional arrangements and a civilian-led transitional government. Such arrangements should clearly define a timeline for free and fair elections, procedures for selecting a transitional prime minister and other key officials, the authorities and role of the military, and dispute resolution mechanisms to help avoid future political crises. Full respect for freedoms of association, expression, and peaceful assembly is vital. We have consistently condemned violence against and unjust detentions of peaceful protesters and called for those responsible to be held accountable. We support Sudanese calls for accountability into incidents of violence, including through transitional justice mechanisms. We condemn recent violence in Darfur, Blue Nile, and elsewhere, which only deepens the dire humanitarian situation on the ground, erodes the gains of the Juba peace agreement, and hinders efforts to achieve sustainable peace. Ongoing violence demonstrates the urgent need for the Juba peace agreement to be implemented, including the full deployment of the security-keeping forces in Darfur, inclusive security sector reform, robust international monitoring and reporting mechanisms, and comprehensive, inclusive, and transparent transitional justice processes, including accountability for violence against civilians and other human rights abuses and violations. Finally, Madam President, we are further concerned by the heavy rains and flash flooding that continue to affect tens of thousands of people across Sudan. These events underscore the continuing impact of climate change on vulnerable communities. The United States is supporting the provision of safe drinking water, hygiene kits, emergency shelter items, and more to the most affected communities. Long-standing USAID disaster preparedness programs in Sudan are also responding through the distribution of pre-positioned relief supplies. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Brazil.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin for thanking for their briefings Ambassador Agema, the Special Representative of the Secretary General for Sudan, Volker Perthes, and Mr. Ibrahim Mundami. I also welcome the delegation of Sudan to this session. Our delegation will raise 3 points. First, we are concerned about violence both in Darfur and in the Blue Nile region. We extend our heartfelt sympathy and condolences to the families of the victims. We are distressed by rising intercommunal violence and regret how fighting has significantly displaced Sudanese women, men, and their children. We call on Sudan's authority to increase their efforts to protect civilians in these areas and enhance accountability. Conducive conditions for the safe return of displaced persons are also vital. My second point, We regard the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement as one of the cornerstones to addressing the root causes of conflict in Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile region. Accordingly, we commend the Sudanese authorities for the progress in establishing the Joint Security Keeping Force in Darfur. However, a quicker, bolder implementation of the agreement is necessary. Otherwise, the Juba Peace Agreement will fail to inspire credibility for the Sudanese civilians. After all, frequent outbreaks of violence have shown that palliative measures alone cannot provide security to civilians in Darfur and the two areas. Third, we consider that the transition to democracy is another cornerstone to addressing the root causes of conflict in the country. We thus welcome the Sudanese Bar Association's draft transitional constitution. We appreciate the active participation of several civil society representatives in the association's drafting committee. Above all, we reiterate our support for the trilateral mechanism, crucial work. We regard as particularly critical the facilitation efforts of UNITAMS, the African Union, and IGAD. Madam President, an urgent way out of the stalemate that the Sudanese society has reached is necessary. In order to break this deadlock, we underscore our support for a political dialogue that is inclusive, Sudanese-owned, and paves the way for a legitimate democratic transition in Sudan. And I thank you.
Merci.
I thank the representative of Brazil for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of China.
Madam President, I thank SISG Perthus for his briefing and welcome the permanent representative of Sudan to today's meeting. I also listened carefully to Mr. Mudawi. Sudan is now at a critical stage of political transition, while political challenges and uncertainties remain. The relevant parties have stayed the course of dialogue and consultation in search for a way to restore the transitional government and continue political transition. We have noted the announcement by the Sudanese military in July to withdraw from the political dialogue to allow space for political forces to form a government. Political groups have put forward many proposals for the establishment of the government. The trilateral mechanism of the UN, the AU, and the IGAD has also been working to facilitate internal political dialogue in Sudan. Facts have repeatedly proven that the Sudan's problem can only be solved by finding a path that accords with its national conditions and interests of the country and its people, while the imposition of external solutions and single-minded pursuit of quick results will not be conducive to lasting political stability. The international community should adhere to the principle of a Sudanese-led and owned process, remain patient as necessary for inter-Sudanese consultation dialogue, and offer support and encouragement to political efforts of all Sudanese parties. In response to recent intercommunal clashes in Darfur, the Sudanese government took prompt measures to fulfill its responsibility for the protection of civilians. Some progress has been made in implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement as Permanent Ceasefire Committee continues to play its role in eliminating violent conflict, and first cohort of 2,000 soldiers of Darfur Joint Security Keeping Force successfully graduated. This wouldn't have been possible without sustained political inputs of the Sudanese government and relevant signatories. It should be noted that financial shortfalls are hobbling the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement on the ground. This is a hard-won agreement. The international community should doubly cherish the agreement and provide financial and technical support to accelerate its implementation. The sanctions imposed by the Council in relation to Darfur have severely restricted the Sudanese government's ability to maintain stability and protect civilians there. The measures should be adjusted in light of the evolving situations until they are lifted. China regrets that the Council was not able to set benchmarks for adjusting Sudan sanctions before August 31st as required by the resolution, and urges the pen holder to earnestly fulfill responsibilities, resume consultation as soon as possible, and make the utmost efforts for consensus. We stress that the benchmarks should be clear, well-defined, and realistic. They should not go beyond the Darfur issue and existing sanction measures, nor should they become a political tool to delay the lifting of sanctions against Sudan. The government of Sudan has stated its position on benchmarks in its letter to the Council dated August 31st, which deserves positive responses from the pen holder and other members of the Council. At present, Sudan's economy and people's livelihood continue to deteriorate. As drought and floods take turns to hit the country, food security and displacement are urgent issues to be solved, and its humanitarian situation faces grave challenges. While the Sudanese people are most in need, politically motivated suspension of economic aid and debt relief will aggravate the economic and humanitarian stress of Sudan and will not help it get out of the current predicament. China calls upon relevant countries and international organizations to adopt responsible policies, resume international assistance to the Sudan as soon as possible, and assist the country in economic and humanitarian relief. China sincerely supports Sudan's peace and development and attaches no political condition in doing so. In the wake of the severe floods that affected multiple areas in Sudan, China immediately sent a message of sympathy to be followed by disaster relief assistance. China will continue to strengthen exchange and cooperation in various fields between the two countries and provide support and assistance to Sudan to the best of our abilities. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of India.
Thank you, Madam President. Let me begin by thanking SRSG Volker Perthes for his detailed briefing on the activities of the UN mission in Sudan. I also thank Ibrahim Mudawi on his presentation. The political transition process that began 3 years ago continues to face obstacles on the ground. While recent months have witnessed some welcome developments, a stalemate in the process has continued. The latest announcements by the leadership of the Sovereign Council, annulment of the nationwide emergency, release of political detainees, as well as a decrease in the security incidents are positive signs. We reiterate that Sudanese-led and Sudanese-owned inclusive and credible political dialogue remains critical in efforts to find a lasting solution to the current impasse. In this context, we note the initiatives taken by the trilateral mechanism, including their advocacy for the creation of conducive conditions which could enable negotiations between the military and civilians. We encourage the mechanism to continue its efforts and assist Sudanese stakeholders in finding a way forward. We continue to underscore the importance of implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement. While the pace of implementation of various provisions of the agreement has remained slow, we note the integration of 2,000 armed movement members into the Joint Security Keeping Force and signing of the Native Administration legislation. We also note the progress made with regard to transitional security arrangements for Darfur through the activities of the Darfur Permanent Ceasefire Committee. This momentum needs to be sustained in coming days. The prevailing intercommunal violence in West Darfur can only be tackled effectively by prioritizing reconciliation and addressing the political and security-related issues. The signing of local peace agreements should be supported by providing necessary resources. The support of the UN mission to Sudan will be critical through the coming months, particularly in assisting the political transition, implementation of the Juba Agreement, and peace-building efforts. The ongoing Council deliberations on devising benchmarks for UNSC sanctions on Sudan, currently supervised and implemented by the 1591 Committee of the Security Council must also consider the complex interplay of local factors at work without resorting to an overly prescriptive approach. We have noted the penholder's decision to keep in abeyance a decision on sanctions benchmarks for Sudan. This is a welcome move to keep the Security Council united on a sensitive issue like sanctions. On the economic front, the suspension of a significant portion of international donor assistance, together with the pause in engagement by international financial institutions, has severely impacted the inflows of overseas development assistance. The funding shortfalls are also impacting the activities of humanitarian actors and their ability to meet growing needs. Madam President, India has long-standing relations with Sudan and its people. Over the years, India has assisted Sudan through several projects under concessional lines of credit, capacity building, and humanitarian assistance. India hopes to see Sudan emerge as a prosperous, peaceful, and stable country, and towards that objective, we will continue to support Sudan and its people. We remain confident that the people of Sudan will overcome the current challenges and press further ahead towards securing a stable and prosperous future. Thank you.
I thank the representative of India for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Gabon.
I have the honor to make this statement on behalf of the E3, Ghana, Kenya, and my country, Gabon. I thank the Special Representative Volker Perthes for his briefing, and we have taken note of the presentation made by Ibrahim Mudawi from the civil society. I also welcome my brother Ambassador Harold Agyeman, chairman of the 1591 Sanctions Committee, for his report on the committee's activity. I welcome the participation of the permanent representative of Sudan at this meeting. Madam President, the E3 stands in solidarity with the people of Sudan amidst the ongoing political, economic, security, and humanitarian challenges. We also recognize that there are opportunities that must be seized in order to make progress in Sudan. On the political level, the protracted stalemate among the parties on establishing a viable political process to return the country back to the democratic transition process is rolling back the gains made by Sudan since 2019 revolution. We encourage all Sudanese stakeholders to heed to the call by the African Union and the international community to unconditionally participate in the Sudanese-owned and Sudanese-led process under the facilitation of the trilateral mechanism of IGAD, AU, and UN. We welcome the publication last week of the new draft of constitutional framework, which is a key step in the stabilization process in Sudan. To this end, we call on the Sudanese authorities and all stakeholders, including civilian and military, to commit during the negotiation of this constitutional framework and also to embrace an inclusive and constructive dialogue with representation of all segments of society, including women and the youth. All parties must show flexibility given the urgency of the situation on the ground and the wariness of the population expressed during the various demonstrations. The E3 welcomes some of the progress made during the reporting period, including the signing of Native Administration Bill by the Governor of Darfur in accordance with the Juba Peace Agreement, as well as completion of the training of first group of the Joint Security Keeping Force. We also welcome the release of political detainees, which constitutes an essential confidence-building measure. We hope that these positive signals will be the basis for a new page in the political process. The E3 further acknowledges the outcome of 39th Extraordinary IGAD Summit held in Nairobi, including the meeting between Ethiopia Prime Minister, His Excellency Abiy Ahmed, and General Al-Burhan, with a view to diffusing tensions in the Al-Fashaga border area. We sincerely hope that this positive step, important for regional stability, will bear the expected fruits. It is essential that the peaceful resolution of dispute takes precedence between neighboring states. Madame la Présidente,
Madam President, at the security level, the A3 remain deeply concerned by the recurrent intercommunal clashes in a number of regions of the country, specifically in West Darfur and in the Blue Nile region. That having been said, we welcome the measures undertaken by the Sudanese authorities to end this violence with the signing of the cessation of hostilities agreement between the members of the communities in conflict. We remain convinced that additional measures can be adopted by the government to tackle the root causes of these conflicts. This requires full participation of local communities, of civil society, and of displaced persons in the peace process. The A3 also takes note of the report presented by the Sudan on 8 September 2022 to the President of the Security Council on progress achieved in the implementation of the National Civilian Protection Plan. We urge the Sudanese government to redouble efforts and to accelerate the achievement of outstanding objectives with support from UNITAMS and the United Nations country team. Madam President, the deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the Sudan is alarming. The current economic crisis, the adverse consequences of climate change, and the risk of food shortages continue to exacerbate the situation. We note with deep concern the impact of climate change on lives, livelihoods, and safety and security of people. Cycles of floods and droughts are compounding an already tenuous and fragile situation in vulnerable parts of the Sudan and resulting in mass displacements of people. Given the magnitude of humanitarian needs, the A3 joins the call of the Secretary General for the mobilization of the international community to finance humanitarian operations. Moreover, we urge the Sudanese authorities to facilitate unimpeded humanitarian access, including in conflict zones. The A3 appreciates the efforts of UNITAMS and the United Nations country teams as they continue to provide assistance to the Sudanese people despite a difficult environment. We urge UNITAMS to continue to work in close cooperation with the Sudanese authorities to facilitate the expeditious implementation of development plans and programs. To conclude, the A3 reaffirms our solidarity with the Sudanese people and our ongoing support for efforts to achieve a lasting peace. Thank you. I thank the representative of Gabon for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Mexico.
Señora Presidenta.
Thank you very much, Madam President. First and foremost, we'd like to thank Mr. Pertz and Mr. Boudaoui for their briefings. The situation in Sudan, 11 months since the coup d'etat, shows the urgency of restoring functional civilian government. It is clear that the Sudanese people do not accept usurpation of power by force, and the democratic transition needs to be led by civilians. The announcement of the withdrawal of the military component of the trilateral mechanism could serve as an opportunity to facilitate dialogue between the civilian parties in order to find consensus. We call on all involved actors to participate constructively in the process. Madam President, it is also essential that the authorities create an environment which is propitious to holding such a dialogue. That would include avoiding the use of force, arrest of demonstrators, and ensuring that the rights to expression and peaceful association be upheld. Mexico deplores the deaths in the context of the last demonstration of the 30th of June. And we are also very concerned by reports of sexual harassment and intimidation against women and children in the context of these demonstrations. We would call on the authorities to expedite the work of the committees established in the past to investigate possible human rights violations in the context of these protests and to provide the necessary resources so that they can do their work effectively. The results of these investigations should be made public. Accountability, transitional justice, and the reform of the rule of law are all key to stability in the country and national reconciliation. There has been little progress in implementation of the peace agreement of Juba, with a couple of notable exceptions. Political will is vital in order to make progress and achieve results, such as the graduation of 2,000 members from the Joint Security Force. Also, we hope that the Permanent Committee on the Ceasefire will continue its important work to reduce tensions. Madam President, we are deeply concerned by the uptick in violence in the regions of Blue Nile, Darfur, and South Kordofan, and since the coup d'etat. We urge the authorities to redouble their efforts to protect civilians, improve the mechanisms for earlier warning, alerts, and ensure accountability. As in other cases, weapons proliferation is one of the main factors fueling the violence. The return of the armed groups from Libya to Darfur with heavy weapons and military vehicles, amongst other things, are a source of extreme concern since they remain in the hands of the armed groups. The interruption of the transition period has exacerbated the economic and humanitarian situations. As long as there is no progress in implementation of security measures in Darfur, massive civilian displacements will continue. The most recent analysis of the classification of food security shows an increase of 2 million people in a state of vulnerability. The current figure of 11.7 million people that was referred to by the Special Representative will continue to increase as long as we do not root out the causes of violence. Along these lines, we would like to express our deep-seated concern for the obstacles to non-governmental organizations, agencies, and funds and programs of the United Nations in their operations. Mexico calls for unrestricted access for the United Nations and its partners in providing humanitarian assistance. Finally, Madam President, many of the achievements of the transition government are at risk of being lost. It is time for all involved in the political process to interact in a constructive manner and put the national interest first. It is time to restore a democratic transition government and for the hope of the people of Sudan of peace and stability being possible. Thank you.
Je remercie le représentant du...
I thank the representative of Mexico for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Albania.
Thank you, Madam President. I also thank SRSG Perth for his update and the civil society briefer, Mr. Ibrahim Mudawi, for his insights. We also welcome the representative of Sudan to this meeting. Albania supports UNITAMS, and we commend SRSG's and his team's continued efforts in supporting the Sudanese people and their aspirations to form a credible civilian-led democratic government. Madam President, Albania is deeply concerned with the dire humanitarian situation in Sudan, which has worsened due to the severe flooding. We express our condolences to the victims' families, and we urge the Sudanese authorities to ensure that all measures are in place to prevent the current situation from further deteriorating. Humanitarian needs are at very high level in Sudan, and the Sudanese authorities must also provide unfettered humanitarian access to all affected by conflict. Intercommunal violence, in particular in the Blue Nile region, must stop. Albania stands with the Sudanese people and echoes their call to live safely and with dignity. In this regard, Albania supports the continued efforts of UNITAMS, African Union, IGAD, in creating the conditions which could enable negotiations between the military and civilians. However, we urge the political actors and prominent military figures who have withdrawn from these talks to go back to the negotiation table and engage in the political processes. The critical need for all stakeholders to engage in reaching an agreement and finding a common, comprehensive solution is more urgent than ever. Madam President, as we heard, no major progress has been made in implementation of the Juba Peace Agreement. The worsening situation in Darfur and the significant outbreaks of violence in the capital and throughout the country concerns us deeply. We condemn in the strongest terms the security forces' extensive and widespread use of violence on protesters. Albania urges the Sudanese authorities to independently and impartially investigate any allegations of human rights violations and abuses, sexual and gender-based violence, in particular those committed by members of the security forces. In concluding, we applaud the Sudanese Bar Association's publication of a draft transitional constitution framework document for Sudan. This is a significant initiative to build upon. Moreover, the Sudanese civil society has clearly expressed its willingness to be the main character in shaping the future of its country. In this regard, we also encourage the active engagement of women as the right step forward for their meaningful participation in democratic processes. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Albania for that statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Madam President, we are grateful to the Special Representative of the Secretary General, Volker Perthes, for the information about developments in Sudan. We have taken note of the report of the chair of the 1591 Security Council Committee, the permanent representative of Ghana to the United Nations, Harold Agiman, on the work of the Security Council subsidiary body over the past 90 days. We welcome the participation in today's meeting of the permanent representative of Sudan to the United Nations, Mr. Idris. We listened closely to the statement delivered by Ibrahim Modawi. Sudan continues to endure a difficult time. The political landscape in the country remains fractured and polarized. Against the backdrop of the suspension of a significant share of donor assistance, humanitarian and socioeconomic challenges remain unresolved. We are troubled by what arose in July, the deadlock in negotiations between local political forces carried out with assistance of the trilateral mechanism of the United Nations, the AU, and IGAD. At the same time, we note there have proliferated initiatives to address this. We believe that the success of these initiatives will hinge on the capacity to make them the ability to make them inclusive in nature with the participation of all of the politically significant forces in the country. Against this backdrop, we welcome the important steps undertaken by the government of Sudan to stabilize the political situation, as well as the willingness that has been demonstrated to embrace compromise. We specifically noted the statement of the chair of the Sovereignty Council, Mr. Burhan, dating 4 July this year, during which he announced the withdrawal of the military leadership from the internal Sudanese political process in order to grant an opportunity for the civil politicians themselves to reach agreement on the new transitional government, as well as the willingness of military to disband the Sovereignty Council while maintaining a focus on defense and national security. This step, in our view, demonstrates a responsible and constructive approach on the part of the country's leadership. We continue to believe that the Sudanese people can and should independently resolve their internal issues. External intervention in the affairs of a sovereign Sudan is not acceptable. We are all aware of the consequences of attempts to create, on the basis of Western patterns, dubious democratizing and socioeconomic schemes. This merely compounded the burden on the people, undermined trust, and undermined trust in the transitional authorities. We do not agree with the qualification of what transpired on 25 October 2021 as a coup, which is contained in the report on the activities of UNITAMS, and this was supported by specifically Western colleagues. We believe that it is not acceptable that the document links the resumed international assistance for Sudan's development, 2, transfer of power to civilian government, mobilization of international support for the country experiencing myriad difficulties is not an award for any achievement, but rather one of the main tasks of the special political mission. Otherwise, such conditions can be assessed and viewed as an act of manipulation or tool of pressure to be exerted on the Sudanese authorities. In this connection, we urgently call on the head of UNITAMS, Mr. Pertes, to operate strictly in line with his mandate, each of the components of which warrants equal attention. Otherwise, we are liable to lose the trust of the Sudanese authorities. This will deliver a grave blow to the United Nations presence. We should like to avoid such a turn of events. Madam President, we fully support the measures undertaken by the Sudanese government to normalize life in Darfur and to stamp out outbreaks of intercommunal violence. We note with satisfaction the recently concluded preparations in the region of the first 2,000-strong contingent of the Joint Security Keeping Force. We welcome the lengthy visit to Darfur of the Deputy Chair of the Sovereignty Council, Mohamed Hamdan Daglo, and the initiatives advanced during this visit on reconciliation, as well as other events that were carried out. We believe that this work should be paid greater attention to in the Secretary General's report. Madam President, we believe that the arms embargo imposed against Sudan 17 years ago now fails to reflect the situation on the ground in Darfur. It is obstructing implementation of the authorities' plans in the area of state building and hampers socioeconomic development in the region. In this connection, we are disappointed by the decision of American penholders of the Sudan sanctions dossier to end work on the Security Council document on benchmarks for the lifting of the arms embargo. We believe that this is an irresponsible approach, as a result of which, for the second consecutive year, the Security Council has sabotaged its own decisions on reconsideration of Sudanese sanctions. Thank you for your attention.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for that statement, and I will now make a statement in my capacity as a representative of France. I thank the Special Representative Volker Perthes and Professor Moudawi for their briefings, and I would also like to greet Sudan for its participation in this meeting, and I'd like to underscore 3 items. First, we regret the political impasse which has continued since the coup d'etat of 25 October 2021. We call on all parties to identify an exit path from the political crisis and to work towards the formation of a credible civilian government. We encourage all Sudanese, both civil society and military, to participate in the dialogue and set aside their differences for the former and to not stir things up for the latter. We call on the military to take no measures that would extend the current impasse. France continues to support the joint facilitation of the United Nations, the African Union, and IGAD. We take note of the lifting of the state of emergency and the release of a number of political detainees. We also commend the opening of investigations against violators of human rights and international humanitarian law. It remains necessary to put an end to the violence against demonstrators, and under this item, we are concerned with the maintenance of heightened political powers put in place for the police during the state of emergency. We call for the lifting of immunity for security forces and preservation of evidence of violence committed against demonstrators. Moreover, the rights to defense of people who have been detained should be upheld. Second, political instability continues to exacerbate the security, economic, and humanitarian situations. The absence of legitimate authorities and good prospects for a peace process exacerbate the security situation in the periphery, in Darfur, and also in the Blue Nile region, which has been grappling with significant clashes since July. We applaud the integration of 2,000 combatants within the joint force, and we also take note of the information shared by Sudan with regard to implementation of the National Plan for Protection of Civilians. It's urgent to expedite the deployment of the joint force and reintegration of combatants. Given the unraveling of the economic and humanitarian situation, France and the European Union remain committed to the Sudanese people. Sudan is one of the main countries impacted by exacerbation of food insecurity caused by the Russian aggression in Ukraine. The European Union has allocated 41 million euros to Sudan to grapple with the situation and will increase it to 189 million euros between now and the end of the year. European humanitarian assistance has been maintained at 69 million euros at this stage of 2022. And finally, the European Union will continue its stabilization projects in Darfur, South Kordofan, and the Blue Nile in partnership with the United Nations for the sum of some 15.75 million euros. Item 3, we applaud the efforts of Sudan to bring regional stability in a particularly difficult context. We would encourage Sudan to continue to show restraint concerning the border dispute with Ethiopia in the El Fashaga Triangle, and to continue its useful role in accompanying Chad in its transition and implementation of the peace agreement with South Sudan. Thank you.
Je reprends mes fonctions.
I resume my function as President of the Council, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sudan.
Moudaoui. J'espère que vous me donnez une minute ou deux pour le répondre.
I
think Dr. Moudaoui is an academician, and I welcome his statement, but I found it very gloomy account in connection to the existing conditions in Sudan. As he is an academician, I will try to refer him to Professor Roger McGinty's book, Everyday Peace, when he said peace is resilient, growing, and persisting in many disruptive elements. It requires transgress of common narrative, involvement of actors. Peace building, therefore, is like a weed growing up from concrete. Peace building cannot be pursued by highly politicized methods and taking sides, calling spade sometimes is not helping. Shukran, Sayyida Raisa.
Thank you, Madam President. I would like to thank Volker Perthes, Special Representative of the Secretary General and Head of UNITAMS, for his briefing. I thank all briefers. Political actors in Sudan continue their efforts to reach a political consensus, as there are various initiatives to reach convergences among Sudanese factions to end the political stalemate and to renew hope in democracy, championed by young people in Sudan with their commitment and their sacrifices to build a bright future where freedom, peace, and justice will prevail. The Sudanese political forces are cognizant of the fact that the current stalemate is an exceptional state and that the country needs now a political consensus that leads to forming a transitional government that undertakes transitional tasks and prepares for general elections where the people can choose their representative fairly and freely. What I can confirm is that the political process is ongoing. Dialogues will not stop. All parties at the end of the day will give precedence to the interests of the Sudan, its security, its stability, and its transition towards the desired civilian democratic rule. Madam President, against this background, I would like to focus on 4 points. First, around 2 months ago, the chairperson of the Sovereign Council has announced that the military will not be participating in the current political process. I addressed that in my first briefing before the Council in May. The military will withdraw from the political scene to allow space for political and revolutionary forces and other national components to form a government of national competencies that would complete the transitional tasks. The chairperson of the Sovereign Council had expressed hope that the political forces would engage in an immediate and serious dialogue. He stated that following the formation of an executive government, the Sovereign Council would be dissolved and a Supreme Council of Armed Forces would be formed that would assume command over the uniformed forces and would be responsible for defense and security, which are the customary tasks for any armed forces in any country. The political forces, with facilitation by the trilateral mechanism, are negotiating to find a common ground to lay the foundation for an intra-civilian dialogue and political consensus that would ensure the transfer of power to civilians, according to the pledges by the chairperson of the Sovereign Council. The Sudanese armed forces have repeatedly expressed their commitment to sponsoring and protecting the transition in Sudan to achieve the desired goals, namely free and fair elections that would reflect the will and the aspirations of the Sudanese people. The Sudanese armed forces have been committed to prevent any attempt to obstruct the transitional process. Second, we are committed to implementing the Juba peace agreements, especially the security arrangements. We will spare no efforts to engage positively and constructively with other factions that have not yet participated in the peace process. In this context, we renew our commitment to protecting civilians in Darfur, especially women and children, in a way that respects human dignity and respects the rights to which we have committed when we acceded to the relevant international human rights instruments. We will continue implementing the National Plan on the Protection of Civilians. We will continue to form and deploy the joint forces to protect civilians. It is one of the main priorities in Darfur in the current phase. We will also collect unauthorized small arms and light weapons. We will implement DDR programs. And we have sent to your August Council a few days ago the fourth progress report on the implementation of our national plan to protect civilians. There's no doubt that you noticed that the situation in Darfur is improving incrementally, despite some obstacles here and there due to the complicated socioeconomic situations and the impact of climate change on the whole region, and due to scarce technical and financial support to implement the Juba Peace Agreement. And we hope these issues received some attention from the Security Council and donor countries. In this regard, a number of reconciliation meetings among tribes in West and South Darfur have taken place over the past few years under the auspices of the Vice Chairperson of the Sovereign Council. These meetings have been successful and they contributed to enhancing the presence of state authority and rule of law, and they have allowed to address the issues on land and the return of refugees and IDPs to their villages. In the context of the implementation of the Juba Peace Agreements, the first batch of armed movement members that signed the Juba Peace Agreements have graduated. They will be part of the Joint Security Keeping Force in Darfur. The authorized strength of this force will be 12,000 elements. 50% are government forces and 50% are Darfur Armed Movement members that signed the Juba Peace Agreements. The government is providing equipment and vehicles to the force from its own scarce resources. The training of the first batch is a fundamental step to implement the security arrangement. It was impossible to implement those arrangements properly due to the lack of financial and technical support, and as donors have not honored their pledges. The government is facilitating the Permanent Ceasefire Committee headed by UNITAMS. The committee continues its work in Darfur. We call upon the international community to provide financial support to continue to implement all provisions of the Juba Peace Agreement, especially as the security arrangements of the Juba Peace Agreement and the related DDR programs is a highly complex and highly costly operation from an organizational, logistical, and financial point of view. We thank friendly countries that have been supporting these efforts. We stress that UNITAMS has a role to play in this regard. rather than simply saying that the implementation of the agreement has been slow. What has UNITAMS done to play its role to implement the agreement with the pace it desires? Third, the transitional government has taken economic and financial measures that include deregulating the Sudanese pound against foreign currency and lifting subsidies on commodities and also addressing the accumulating foreign debt. These are necessary measures to address the inherited shortcomings of the economic structure. We're also working on increasing productivity and trade and creating conditions to attract investments that would benefit from the promising potential of Sudan. And for these reforms to achieve their aims, we look forward to the resumption of developing cooperation and development aid programs with bilateral partners. This is important rather than simply criticizing the situation. The reforms are important to reduce the impact of reforms and to reduce the burden of foreign debt that Sudan has qualified for by taking the necessary steps according to the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries initiative. The international community must bear its responsibilities and must provide assistance to hundreds of thousands of refugees from neighboring countries. Add to that the thousands of those affected by floods. Fourth, the Secretary General in his report has failed to mention very important issues. We expected, for instance, that the report would refer to the efforts of the Sudanese government to promote and protect human rights through cooperation with international human rights mechanisms. Sudan has received the UN experts on human rights twice. The latest was in May 2022. We facilitated its mission. He was able to meet with high-level officials. Also, Sudan attended the 50th session of the Human Rights Council in Geneva in June and July 2022. Sudan has also cooperated with the country office of OHCHR in Khartoum. We've cooperated with the prosecutor of the ICC, who has delivered a statement from Khartoum for the first time ever. This is all part of our efforts to promote human rights and justice. The report did not refer to the initiatives that were launched to settle the current crisis. The report included information that fall outside the purview of the mission. Peace building in Sudan requires political neutrality. Otherwise, there would be a negative effect on the political scene and would delay consensus. The report also refer to instances of rape and sexual harassment based on hearsay. These instances were not properly documented. Human rights issues fall under the purview of the country office of OHCHR. Sudan has cooperated with international human rights mechanisms, and we have participated in the latest session of Human Rights Council, as I noted. The statistics in the report of the killings and the injured do not include the injuries sustained by police. The mission should seek and rely on information from the General Prosecution and the Ministry of Health and Police. Also, the source of information has not been mentioned. The report includes the efforts of UNITAMS in political transition, and there has been a disregard for the other three strategic aims that are part of UNITAM's mandate. I wonder, what's UNITAM's role in devising at least plans to implement the Juba peace agreements and its protocols to address the issues of refugees and IDPs and the land and Hawakir and supporting nomads and herders? In addition, the mission has done nothing to provide logistical and financial support to implement the national plan to protect civilians. There's also no progress in mobilizing development and economic resources, although Mr. Perthes has stated that he will increase his efforts with the with the World Bank, rather. I stress that we will work with the partners of the transitional process through dialogue, which is indispensable to address the challenges of a political transition in Sudan. We will work with the international community to address the challenges that obstruct the transitional process and obstruct the reaching of our aims. I wish Mr. Volker Perthes all success in his efforts. Thank you.
Représentant du Soudan pour sa déclaration.
I thank the representative of Sudan for his statement. There are no further speakers on the list. I now invite the members of the Security Council to continue consideration in closed consultations. The meeting stands adjourned.